The night you realize your life hasn't been controlled by circumstances, but by what you believed you were allowed to do, is the night everything begins to change. Because most people are not trapped by walls. They are trapped by assumptions they never questioned, and Peter's life exposes this with brutal clarity. Because he was not born bold, he was not naturally unshakable. He was impulsive, afraid, inconsistent, and yet he became one of the strongest voices in the early church. Not because his circumstances changed first, but because his thinking did, and that is the first lesson. Your prison is not outside you. It is built from what you accept as true without testing it, and you can see it in a real moment. A man standing in a courtyard, firelight flickering, voices around him asking a simple question, "You also were with Jesus?" And Peter responds immediately, "Woman, I don't know him." Luke chapter 22, that is not strategy. That is fear speaking before truth can intervene, and that is exactly how mental prisons operate. Not through force, but through reaction. You don't think, you default, and that default reveals what you actually believe about yourself in that moment. And if you don't see it, you will keep repeating it, because every time pressure comes, you will return to the same pattern, not because you chose it consciously, but because it is what you trained yourself to do. And that is why the second lesson becomes unavoidable. Fear is not random, it is conditioned, and whatever you repeat under pressure becomes your identity unless you interrupt it. Because Peter did not fail once, he denied 3 times, and that repetition matters, because it shows how quickly a pattern locks in when it is not challenged, and most people live exactly like that, not in one big failure, but in repeated small ones that slowly define what they think they are capable of, what they think they deserve, what they think they can risk, and over time, that becomes their reality, not because it is true, but because it is reinforced. And that is the prison, not the event, but the agreement with what the event made you believe about yourself. A shoreline, early morning, smoke rising from a small fire, bread and fish laid out, and a man who had failed standing in front of the one he denied, and instead of being rejected, he is confronted. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Repeated 3 times, not randomly, but precisely, 1 question for each denial, 1 correction for each failure. And this is where the second lesson sharpens. You do not break a pattern by ignoring it. You break it by confronting it at the exact point it was formed. And Jesus does not discuss the past. He rewrites Peter's response in the present. "Feed my sheep," John chapter 21. Responsibility replaces fear. Action replaces avoidance. And that is how mental prisons begin to collapse. Not through explanation, but through rem-pros assignment. Because if Peter had stayed in regret, nothing would have changed. But he was forced into a new identity through action. And this is what most people avoid. They analyze their fear, but do not confront it. They understand their doubt, but do not act against it. And because of that, the pattern remains intact. And that is why the third lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Clarity without action strengthens the prison, because now you see it and still do nothing. And that creates a deeper belief that you cannot change it, and that belief becomes even harder to break because it feels justified. And that is exactly how people stay stuck for years, not because they do not know what to do, but because they never move at the point where it matters. A rooftop in Joppa, midday heat, Peter hungry, waiting, and then a vision that makes no sense to him, animals lowered in a sheet, a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." And his response is immediate resistance. "Surely not, Lord." Acts chapter 10, because it violates everything he has been taught, everything he believes is right. And this is where the third lesson becomes unavoidable. Your beliefs can become your prison if they are never examined. Because Peter was not wrong in what he learned, but he was limited by how he applied it. And most people are exactly there. They are not ignorant, they are rigid. They are holding on to frameworks that once protected them, but now restrict them. And when something new challenges that framework, they resist it automatically. Not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar, and that resistance is what keeps them stuck. Because growth always requires you to question what feels certain, and if you refuse that, you will stay inside a system that no longer serves you, and that is why the fourth lesson matters. God will confront your limits through situations that make you uncomfortable, not to confuse you, but to expand you. And if you reject that confrontation, you remain exactly where you are, not because nothing changed, but because you refuse to change with it. A prison cell, iron chains, guards posted, night deep and silent, and Peter asleep between soldiers, not planning, not panicking, and suddenly an angel appears. Light fills the cell. Quick, get up, and the chains fall off his wrists. Acts chapter 12, and this is where the fourth lesson cuts through everything. Freedom often comes before you feel ready for it, because Peter does not initiate the escape. He responds to it, and most people miss this in their own life. Opportunities appear, doors open, moments shift, but they hesitate because it does not feel real yet. It does not feel safe yet. It does not match their expectation of how change should happen. And because of that hesitation, they stay in a place that has already opened. And that is why the fifth lesson is critical. When the door opens, movement matters more than understanding. Because if Peter had stayed questioning the moment, he would have remained in the cell even though the chains were gone. And that is exactly how mental prisons continue, not because nothing changed, but because you did not move when it did. A crowd gathered, noise rising, accusations forming, leaders pressing in, and the same man who once denied under a simple question now stands and speaks without hesitation. God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. Acts chapter 2. And this is not a personality shift, it is a transformed identity, and that is the fifth lesson. Boldness is not natural, it is built through repeated alignment under pressure. Because Peter did not become fearless, he became consistent. He stopped defaulting to fear and started responding from conviction. And that change did not happen instantly, it was built through moments where he chose differently than before, and that is what most people avoid. They want transformation without repetition. But repetition is what creates stability, and without it, every change remains temporary, because the old pattern is still stronger than the new one, and that is why the sixth lesson becomes unavoidable. You do not become free by one decision, you become free by reinforcing a new pattern until it replaces the old one completely. A confrontation in Antioch, tension rising, behavior shifting under pressure again. Peter was drawing from Gentiles when certain men arrive, and Paul calls him out publicly, because even after transformation, old patterns can attempt to return. Galatians chapter 2. And this is where the sixth lesson cuts deeper than most people expect. Progress does not remove the possibility of regression, it requires maintenance, because Peter was not immune to pressure, he was still capable of slipping, and that is exactly what happens to most people. They change, they grow, they break patterns, and then under new pressure, they revert. Not completely, but enough to destabilize what they built. And that is why the seventh lesson matters. Awareness must be continuous, not occasional. Because the moment you assume you are beyond something, you stop guarding against it, and that is when it returns, not as a full collapse, but as a subtle shift that eventually grows if it is not corrected. A letter written years later, not from a place of fear, but from clarity. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. 1 Peter chapter 5. And this is not theory, this is experience, because Peter lived through fear, failure, correction, growth, and now speaks from a place of alignment. And that is the final lesson. You do not escape your mental prison by force. You escape it by replacing what you believed with what is true, consistently, deliberately, without exception. And that process is not instant. It is built through moments where you choose differently than before, where you confront what you avoided, where you move when you would have hesitated, where you speak when you would have denied, where you challenge what you assumed was fixed. And that is where everything changes, or stays the same, not in what you understand, but in what you do the next time pressure comes. Because that moment will expose whether you are still in the prison or have actually stepped out of it. And that decision, repeated over time, is what defines whether your life remains limited by what you once believed or is reshaped by what you finally chose to confront and change. A small fishing boat, waves rising under a dark sky, wind cutting through the water, and a man stepping onto the surface, knowing it makes no sense, knowing it should not hold him, and yet for a moment it does, until his attention shifts, until fear replaces focus, and then he begins to sink. Lord, save me, and immediately a hand reaches out, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Matthew chapter 14. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Your mind determines whether you stand or sink long before your circumstances do. Because nothing around Peter changed in that moment. The storm was the same, the water was the same, the distance was the same. His focus shifted, and that shift changed the outcome instantly. And that is exactly how mental prisons operate. Not by changing your environment, but by changing where your attention rests. Because whatever you focus on expands, and whatever expands begins to define your reality. And most people live there without realizing it. They focus on risk, on failure, on what could go wrong. And that focus strengthens fear until it feels like truth. And once it feels like truth, it controls their actions. And that is why the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Doubt is not passive. It actively pulls you away from what you were already stepping into. Because Peter did not fall before he stepped out, he fell after. And that means you could be moving in the right direction and still collapse if your focus shifts at the wrong moment. And that is where most people lose progress, not at the beginning, but in the middle, when pressure increases, when uncertainty rises, when the initial momentum fades, and they begin to question what they already committed to, and that questioning weakens their position until it breaks. And this is where the next truth becomes critical. Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Matthew chapter 14. Because fear was not removed from the situation, it was confronted within it, and that is the difference between those who move forward and those who stay stuck. One expects fear to disappear before acting, the other moves through it and refuses to let it dictate the outcome, and that refusal is what builds stability, not the absence of fear, but control over it. And if you do not develop that, every new step will feel unstable. Every opportunity will feel risky, every decision will feel uncertain, and over time, you will begin to avoid movement altogether, not because you cannot move, but because you cannot move, but because you no longer trust your ability to stay standing once you do. And that is the prison, not the storm, but the belief that you cannot hold your position inside it. And until that belief is challenged, nothing changes, no matter how many opportunities appear in front of you. A courtyard again, different night, colder air, voices sharper this time, a servant girl staring, then another, then others joining in, pressure building not from danger alone, but from attention, from eyes waiting for a response. And Peter answers without thinking, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately the rooster crows, and the sound cuts through everything because it exposes the pattern, not the moment, the pattern. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, and he went outside and wept bitterly. Luke chapter 22. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. You don't break your life in one moment. You repeat a pattern until it defines you. Because Peter did not fail once, he failed in sequence, faster each time, more automatic each time, less controlled each time, and that is exactly how mental prisons strengthen, not through one decision, but through repetition under pressure. Because repetition removes awareness, it turns choice into reflex, and once something becomes reflex, you no longer question it, you act from it, and that is where most people get trapped. Not because they chose the wrong thing once, but because they stopped choosing altogether. They began reacting, and reaction always follows the strongest pattern, not the highest intention, and that is why the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Regret does not break patterns, interruption does. Because Peter wept, but the tears did not change what happened. They revealed it. They exposed the gap between what he believed and how he acted. And most people stop there. They feel regret, they feel guilt, they replay the moment, but they do not interrupt the pattern that created it. And because of that, they repeat it again later under a different form. And this is where the next truth becomes sharp, because the look Jesus gave Peter was not rejection, it was awareness. It forced him to see himself clearly, without explanation, without excuse, without distortion. And that clarity is what most people avoid, because it removes every justification. It shows you exactly what you default to when pressure rises, and if you do not confront that, you will keep building your life on reactions. You do not control, and that is why the next lesson matters. Awareness without action becomes self-sabotage, because now you see the pattern but still follow it, and that creates a deeper belief that you cannot change it. And once that belief sets in, the prison becomes stronger, not because the pattern improved, but because your expectation of yourself dropped. And that expectation determines everything that follows, your risks, your decisions, your limits, and if it stays low, your life will reflect it, no matter how much potential you actually have. And that is exactly why the next moment in Peter's life matters more than the failure itself, because failure exposed the pattern, but what he does after determines whether it continues or breaks. A locked room, doors bolted, voices low, the same men who walked with Jesus, now hiding, not planning, not moving, just waiting, because fear has a way of shrinking everything, even when nothing outside has changed. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Your environment does not have to change for your behavior to collapse. Your internal state is enough, because the threat in that moment was not immediate, but the memory of what could happen controlled them more than what was actually happening. And that is exactly how mental prisons tighten, not through present danger, but through anticipated risk. And John records it clearly. On the evening of that first day of the week, the doors were locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, John chapter 20, and that detail matters. Locked, not because they were being chased, but because they expected something. And expectation shapes behavior more than reality does. And this is where most people lose ground, not in actual crisis, but in imagined continuation of it. They build decisions around what might happen instead of what is happening, and that creates limitations that feel justified, but are not real yet. And over time, those limitations become permanent because they are never tested, never challenged, never proven wrong. And that is why the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Fear grows strongest in isolation, because without contradiction, without movement, without exposure to reality, it feeds on itself. It builds scenarios, it amplifies risk, it convinces you that staying still is safer than stepping out, and that belief becomes your boundary, not because it is true, but because it is, unchallenged. And this is where everything shifts, because Jesus does not remove the situation first. He enters it. Peace be with you, spoken inside the locked room, not outside it, not after it changed, inside it. And that is critical, because it shows that the change they needed was not external first, it was internal, and that is the next lesson. Transformation begins where you are hiding, not where you are comfortable. Because if you wait for the environment to feel safe before you move, you will stay locked in longer than necessary. And that is exactly what most people do. They wait for clarity, for confidence, for assurance. And while they wait, the fear that kept them in place becomes stronger, more convincing, more permanent. And that is how people lose years, not because they were incapable, but because they never challenged what they believed would happen if they stepped out. And until that belief is confronted, nothing changes, because every decision continues to be filtered through the same untested fear, and that fear becomes the structure of the prison itself. A shoreline again, but this time not for comfort, for confrontation. A charcoal fire burning, the same setting as the night of denial, the same smell, the same memory, and this is not accidental because the place where you broke is often the place where you must be rebuilt. And that is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. You do not escape your mental prison by avoiding your past. You break it by returning to it with a different response, because if you never revisit the point of failure, the pattern remains untested, uncorrected, and ready to repeat. And this is exactly what happens. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" John chapter 21. Not once, 3 times. And that repetition matters, because it mirrors the denial, one question for each failure, one opportunity to respond differently at the exact point where the pattern was formed. And this is where most people fail to complete the process. They move forward without revisiting what broke them. They build new situations on top of old patterns, and because those patterns were never corrected, they resurface. Not immediately, but inevitably. And that is why the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. Healing requires targeted confrontation, not general change, because general change feels like progress, but targeted confrontation breaks patterns, and without that, nothing truly shifts. And this is where the pressure increases, because Peter is not just answering a question, he is redefining himself in real time. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And with each response, the assignment follows. Feed my sheep. Because identity is not just corrected through words, it is reinforced through responsibility. And this is where most people stop too early. They say they changed, they believe they changed, but they do not take on the actions that would prove it under pressure. And without that reinforcement, the new identity remains fragile, easily replaced by the old one when pressure returns. And that is exactly why responsibility is part of the process, because responsibility forces consistency. It forces repetition. It forces you to act from the new position until it becomes stable, and that is what transforms temporary change into permanent shift. And without it, everything remains reversible, because nothing has been tested enough to hold under real conditions. And that is why the moment at the fire matters more than the failure itself, because failure revealed the pattern, but confrontation rewrote it. And that rewriting is what determines whether the prison remains or collapses completely. A crowded street in Jerusalem, voices rising, tension thick, the same man who once hid, now standing in front of the very people who had the power to destroy him. And this time, there is no hesitation, no retreat, no attempt to protect himself, only clarity. We must obey God rather than human beings. Acts chapter 5. And this is where the next lesson becomes unavoidable. Your environment does not change your courage, your identity does, because the risk in that moment is real, not imagined, not anticipated, but present. And yet his response is completely different, not because the situation became easier, but because he became stable, and that stability is what breaks the prison permanently, because once your response changes under real pressure, not controlled conditions, not rehearsed scenarios, but real consequences, then the pattern is no longer dominant, and that is what most people never reach. They change in safe environments. They act differently when nothing is at stake. But when pressure returns, they revert, and that reversion shows that the pattern was not broken, only suppressed. And that is why the next lesson cuts deeper than most expect. True freedom is proven under pressure, not in comfort, because comfort hides instability, but pressure reveals it immediately. And if your response holds under pressure, then something real has changed, and that change cannot be undone easily, because it has been tested, it has been reinforced, it has been lived. And this is where the shift becomes irreversible, not because the risk disappears, but because your response no longer depends on it. And that is the difference between those who remain trapped and those who step out. One avoids pressure to protect themselves. The other faces it and proves something new. And that proof becomes internal evidence, something that changes how they see themselves, how they evaluate risk, how they move forward. And once that internal evidence exists, the old belief loses its power because it has been disproven in reality, not just in theory. And that is why this moment matters more than everything before it, because it is not about understanding anymore, it is about demonstration, and demonstration is what transforms belief into certainty, and certainty is what removes hesitation. And once hesitation is gone, the prison has nothing left to hold on to, because its foundation was always doubt, and without doubt, it collapses completely.